Hey, welcome to this session. In this session, we're going to cover the application insights tables, how we would store our instrumentation, we would store how a user's interaction with the UI, the requests they'd make to our Dataverse APIs, and then the subsequent dependencies within there, where exceptions may be found, as well as how we could store sort of custom numerical metrics, custom events, and so forth. We'll take a look at some helpful Kusto queries. We'll do a demo of reviewing user telemetry from both the mobile device as well as the browser, and start looking at how we can isolate down to specific CRUD operations. So enjoy. Okay, in this session, we're going to cover quick objectives and introduction, cover an overview of tables, distributed transactions and what that looks like, specifically within Dataverse, and look at some Dataverse operations, and we'll wrap with a demo of common operations and some helpful Kusto queries. So our objectives today are to describe application insights tables, identify Dataverse operations, and review common Kusto queries. My name is Ali Yousefi. I am a senior customer engineer with Microsoft. My certifications include Azure Solution Architect, Dynamics 365 Power Platform, as well as Azure DevOps Engineer Experts. I'm also a Microsoft Certified Trainer. Microsoft Services offers a monitoring workshop that will allow you to work with Microsoft engineers to help implement a monitoring strategy for Power Platform and Microsoft Dataverse. Note, this title may change in the future, but please contact your Microsoft representative for any additional information if you're interested in pursuing this workshop. Let's take a look at application insights tables. All right, so we'll start off with one of the most commonly used tables within application insights, being the traces table. The traces table is useful for sending a sort of instrumentation to application insights. So an example here would be using the iLogger interface within plugins within Dataverse. So remember, plugins are business logic that can be registered on specific events within Dataverse. So creating of records, updating of records, deleting, and so forth. Using the iLogger interface, we can thus add instrumentation like we would using the iTracing service. We can flush that same sort of instrumentation to the traces table here. Another common table you'll see is the page views table. The page views table is an interesting one because that helps us sort of look at how users are interacting with our UI. Here we can look at if a user is interacting with the UI via the mobile, if they're doing it through a browser, if they're using it through a desktop app, for instance, so we can see which, what entity they're looking at, what form ID, is it a cold load or not, what's the throughput and latency look like, as well as beginning to start looking at the session and operation IDs for the subsequent calls that would happen within a page view. And going into that, we look at the request table. So request table helps us look at the usage of the web API request, as well as the organization service request. So these requests you could think of as sort of the building blocks of our page view. So an example would be a user opening up an opportunity record, for instance, within the UI. The request to sort of build that page from the data that's needed to paint on the page, to the controls, to the web resources to perform any sort of business logic on the client side. So think of client side scripting and logic using JavaScript. All of those are sort of coming in through request and what we call dependencies of that request. So a request could be get me the data, fetch me what I need for the page to be painted. Within those could be dependencies that we need. So the web resources would be considered a dependency. The CSS files, any sort of JavaScript, those kind of things could be considered dependencies of that request. So the dependency will have an operation ID. That operation ID will be unique for that dependency, but you'll have an operation parent ID, which you can then use to go back up to the request. as well as you'll start looking at the session ID, which will give you sort of the unique session that a user was in within the UI. Next, we have availability results. This one you typically see when you're doing availability testing within appinsights, so doing things such as ping testing, web testing, or using custom availability. So there's another, not part of this bootcamp, but another video I've posted regarding setting up a sort of ping test on the CDS or Dataverse endpoint to ensure uptime and then response. So review that video. There'll be a card here that you can click on to review that video and see how to set up a sort of a service on Azure to ping your Dataverse endpoint for availability. So browser timings allow us to look at sort of think of like how a page view is, how a page or form is loaded, and how it goes from being requested to eventually unloaded. So we think about the four major areas of a page lifecycle: the DNS lookup, TCP, handshake. That area is sort of the first one we have. We go into the request to the server from the client. We have the response from the server back to the client, and finally we have the DOM processing, right? So any of the onload event handlers we have. So all of this will be shown within browser timings and has unique buckets for each one of those. Finally, we have two more tables. One, the custom metrics. So we have a metrics table that we can add things like standard deviation, sums, averages, these kind of numerical values that we can use to track certain things. Maybe we're looking at resources, IO, that kind of thing within our platform. And finally, for custom events, this is where you sort of may not really fit into any of the other tables you see here. This gives us the opportunity to add a custom dimension property bag, as well as a measurements sort of it's a property bag as well, but more towards the integers there. So we have this custom events we can use as sort of a catch-all if we need here. So let's take a moment to visualize what we're looking at here. So this is an example from a Dataverse transaction. So we'll start off with a page view, which again, like we mentioned, the previous slide can be something like retrieving of an opportunity form, right? A user goes, looks at a view, decides whatever record they want to review, and they'll say click into the grid and they'll open up a form. That can be considered their page view. The page view will make a request to our API to get whatever it needs to render the page view. As part of that request, we'll have a dependency to get data. We also have dependencies to get things like the web resources that we need and maybe other pages or whatever else may be considered a dependency for that page view to be able to render properly. So this is an example of what that transaction would look like. On the next slide, we're going to cover something we covered on the continuous export session. So we're going to look at the fields that are within both the page view, the request, dependency tables, as well as the exception tables. So what we'll see next is what it would look like if you set up the continuous export from your appinsights or log analytics. Let's take a look. So here's a look at the four tables that are typically being delivered from Dataverse into application insights. So we have the page view, we have request, we have dependency, and we have exceptions. So for page view here, we show the count of the page view, the metric, the name, the URL, so forth. So this is the model. So when you have your data delivered to your data lake, it'll be serialized into something like this, and then you can deserialize into what you want. For request as well, same idea. This will all be serialized into request files that'll be broken down into, I believe it's still hourly containers within your stores. We'll take a look at that here in a minute. And here's dependencies. So you have your dependency with the success codes and IDs and how they would link back to the request. And then finally your exceptions, which are your full stack, your stack trace, for instance, your outer and inner exceptions, and then where was it failing at, and the exception type and any codes you might have. So next we're going to do a demo of Dataverse operations and Kusto queries. So we'll open up Application Insights, look at some operations that we can have, and we'll look at Kusto queries. We'll look at the Azure Monitor community GitHub repo, and where you can find some queries that can be useful for your organization.
Okay, let's start with the demo here. So I have a Dynamics 365 model app pulled up. I'm on the dashboard as I have loaded the app. So we'll go to, in our case, we'll go to opportunities. I have the network tab here pulled up so we can kind of look and see. You can see all these are different calls made to sort of create this, what you see here in front of you. So we're going to go to My Open Opportunities. We can see the Get Client Metadata calls, update recent items, for instance, is here. Let's go click on a specific record. And we can see all these different calls that are being made to paint this here. Okay. Let's see if we can expand this a little bit. So in here we have our Get Client Metadata, as you see, with the 200 status and the initiator. Let's see what else we could find in here that's interesting. So here's the task that we would have. So I have this one here to call Nisha, and you'd see the response would be here with this. So this is showing how we can collect the task. Most likely above that we'll see the data for the contacts as well, the annotations to bring those in. Here's the opportunities to fetch here. So most likely we have the opportunity is here as well. Let's take a look if I can find it. Okay, here's our opportunity record with our GUID 83E7, and here's all the data that was here. So there's the call we have. Here's the headers that we have. Here's our payload, and I believe we should be able to see how long this call took here. Let's see. Here we go. So here's our request response, time to first byte log here. Yep, so we have all these. Yep, so there's the response, and so forth. Okay. So let's make an update to this. So we'll change the budget amount to 100,000 here, and let's just make sure we're going to be recording. Let's go to the bottom of this. So environment variable, we'll go ahead and click up this recording and hit save. And we're saving. And this came back. Here's our batch. All right, let's see what we have here. So this is a patch, right? Because we did an update. We could see the URL has our primary key in here. We have the payload of what we changed, budget amount of 100,000. Our response back, we should have got, what did we get here as a response? We got the entity ID, the location. Yeah. Looks good, looks good. So there's our 204 that we got back. You see there's other calls that are happening as well, like this batch here, and other things here, this opportunity to go get the order type and so forth. So that was for a create, or excuse me, for an update. We have the patch and the 204. Let's do a new record here. So we'll click new, and we'll do monitoring Bootcamp 2022, add a contact record, set this first one, and we'll add an account to test, to save. So I did miss that one. Let's go ahead and do a new one. Let's do new. Let's do this one more time. Let's do 2. We'll do a new contact, new account, so we can see the batch that'll happen. And see here. Okay, so let's stop it. So what do we have? You have contact information here, here, here. we see a batch. What's inside of our batch payload? We have a post to opportunities, which should be our data here, right? So we added that account record. There's it. There's our contact record. We had an order type that's most likely down here, currency, so forth. So this is the actual create. Now you see it's wrapped in a batch, which will be kind of interesting as we look towards our application insights here. So we have that, and our responses here to 204. Okay, and then you see a bunch of other calls that are being made as well. So let's clear this. Let's delete this record. So we'll delete it. Okay. So we should be good here. Let's go back. So here's this, I believe should be it. So we have a delete verb, and we have the ID we created with a status of 204. And there's an auth activity ID and all these service request IDs and so forth here. One thing too to point out is the about. So we have our session here. I'll go ahead and copy that for us. Let's go take a look at App Insights. Okay, I went ahead and loaded up my App Insights. I have my tables here that we talked about earlier. So we have the page views, the requests, the dependencies, the traces, and exceptions. In our case, we'll look at page views. So what I see is the dashboard load when I first loaded the app. Looking here, we can see this one actually was earlier. I was running it for my mobile application for this demo. So this is from an iPhone, for instance. We can see it's from a mobile app, and we opened up this app module. We had a dashboard load. So we'll save this one for another time here. But first, let's take a look at this here. So we can see that this is from our browser. Look at the timestamp that was just recently. So here's my my model app ID, my cold latency, the entity I was on. Was it a boot type or a cold boot or not? It was not. Here's the load type for the form, and the page name of where it's of what we're doing here. This is a view of opportunity, right? So we have the user ID. This will correlate to the system user ID table, and that'll be the ID for that. We can see where the user was at, what version of the application they were running at, and we can see that there's an operation ID and an operation parent ID which match up. So I'm going to actually copy this for a minute. So I'm going to show what I had copied earlier. So that session ID we had pulled was this 2885. You can see it here. If I pull this up, it should still be the same, right? There's my server version, the 00136. There's that ID. So look at the operation ID for page view has that same session ID here with this this other GUID concatenated onto the end of it. So that'll help us get started here if we wanted to search for any page views from that user. For instance, this session they were in. We do something like operation ID contains keyword, and then put in our GUID here. Let's see if we get anything. We can see now we've got the dialog where I first opened it. Right there. Here's the edit list. So we looked at the opportunity as well as the form here. So here's a form load. It took about 12.9 seconds. Here's the form ID 5959. So let's see. It doesn't show it in this URL here, but in some of the URLs you can see the form ID. But this will correlate to the system form ID that you have for this particular opportunity. So you can see which one the user was using. There's my 00136 as well as my operation ID that includes the session. So that is the form load here. And that's going to show us, is the user interacting. But let's go look at the actual request we made. We want to find out more about what the user was doing. All right, so I'm using the request table. Remember, the request comes from the page view, and we can see calls to our web API. And I'm using that same operation, that session ID that we found that's an operation ID for page view, but I'm searching for the session ID here. I can see is I have the URL, the success, the result code, the duration, and some more information. So this was get opportunity. So this tells me that we're getting opportunity here. If I look at the URL, this one was getting me, looks like multiple opportunities. So this could be something from maybe like a entity view, for instance, when I want to look at multiple opportunities. I had the user ID. Now we see the user ID is changed to the Azure AD object ID. Right? So now I can see the user agent I'm running on. So I'm running on Edge here. And I have my verb that I can search on. And this here will take me back to the page view that I have. So you can see I have this operation ID. I'm going to copy this one, put it over here for a second. And we have that. So that's for the entity view. Look at this one here, this 4D we have. This is getting an opportunity, and this is the 4D. This is the record that we had actually had created that we eventually will delete. That, as you can see, I copied this from our earlier network call, right? 4DE, this is what we see here. 4DE, this is the record we had deleted. And so it's just showing us before that, it's getting that record when we created it. This was the get here. But you don't see the actual create. That's because remember the create was inside of things like this batch. So to see getting specific records, you can use the request table here, kind of see that. But that gets a little tricky when you start looking at creates. So let's see if we can dig a little bit deeper into finding the actual CRUD operations. So using that same operation ID we had from the request, for this particular one we can see a lot of the same stuff we would have found within the network tab within the browser. So the batch call and all the different things needed for this. So here's a UCI request here with all the different information, including the warm latency time to first byte like we saw within the sources here, right? So there's our time to first byte, our stall, encoded body size, and so on. This is pretty helpful here, and you can see all the different UCI requests. Here's even outbound calls to the Graph API and that kind of thing here. So that's pretty good. Here's our opportunity. We see some other saved queries. To look at the CRUD operation themselves, what I'd recommend is looking at this type and looking for, let's do this. Let's do in. So SDK create. SDK retrieve for specific single records, SDK update for updates, and SDK delete for deletes. Let's see what we get here in my session. Okay, so we see we have retrieve opportunity. There's the retrieve. Inside of there, you can get the entity name or entity ID, which should be the GUID of what we're looking for here. So if I want to maybe parse that down a little bit, I can do extend cd parse JSON custom dimension. And now if I want, I can also let's project a little bit, timestamp. Let's do target. We'll do type, name, duration, and let's do CD entity. What was it? ID, right? Let's take a look. Entity ID. Yeah, that looks good. And then we can do operation ID. And parent. Okay, let's see what we get. So we see the retrieve. Here's the entity ID that we have. Retrieve. So the one that we had created earlier should be here as well. So remember the 4D, which was this one. Remember, this is the delete. So we had to create the record, right? Read the record and delete the record. So we see a read here. We see a retrieve, a create of the record. I see there's the create. So when the user did it, and here I would also have my user ID that I could add, as well as my, let's see, retrieve. And see, it creates other things as well, like Teams chats and so on. Keep going, retrieve, create of this demo here, update of opportunity. And you can keep scrolling and scrolling. Like this one's very chatty. So if I want to focus maybe on the delete, let's see if we can find that. And let's just search for that specifically. Let's take these out. So there's our delete with our entity ID that we did. So this one showed 6876. And we could see the 6.96. So we're very, very close to what we see, 6.96 and our 68. This is in milliseconds, right? So 6.87, 6.96. It's right there. So this is the breakdown here with the TTFB and so on, and you can see very similar. I didn't put all that out here, but you could have that. And if you want to collect the user that made the CRUD, yeah, here. You can add the user. And again, this is going to be the Azure AD object ID. Okay, these are like sort of system identifiers. Finally, we said we'd go look at common queries. So if you click on queries, go to this community git repo. This will load up the Azure Monitor community. And inside of Azure services and Dataverse is where we have queries that can be used for page performance, request failures, other errors. This will eventually hopefully get pushed in. We have a pull request here that'll show us our files that we have, including warm and cold form load, request operation verb. So we can take this query, for instance, here and put this into appinsights. And we can break down by user the post, how many operations they were making. This is anything older than that. So this is by user, so post, and this is the actual verb. But if I want to go do maybe something a little bit different, let's see. So here's our update and so on. Let's take a look at this one. So in here we have sort of timelines similar to the analytic pane within the PPAC for create, delete, retrieve, multiple, update. And I can spin this up here. Let's actually compare it. All right, so I've dragged this over. This is the Dataverse Analytics. You can see the times here. Notice how this looks very similar. We have our peak. We have sort of this plateau looking thing, this extreme peak matches up, and then we start moving up here. So this is actually very close to what we have. This is showing a little bit more real time because of the work we've been doing just now during the demo. So this is how you can get started here. And this query is available within the Azure Monitor community. There's the results for it. You can break it down by user and how many retrieve multiples they were making, creates they were doing, and so forth. And you can see summarize the events counts and how we're doing that. So that ends this demo. Thank you for watching.